All right, well, we're about to start. All right, go.
Good morning, viewers. I am Kizaya Senbryce Isidore.
And good morning to all. I'm a familiar face here. My name is Joshua Harrow, a former senator and youth parliamentarian.
Okay.
So, want to say good morning to the people on this
Good morning.
wonderful sitting of Youth Parliament for the year 2026. How do you
Yes.
feel being?
I feel elated because the young people have so much to bring. What do you expect to see here today?
I expect to see a lot of humor like last year.
Yes.
And it was very funny. But our young people are coming together to sit in this wonderful house to debate an important bill, and it is actually the repertory, if I may say, the repertory
Yes.
justice resolution of 2026. It's going to be a very important debate as we speak about the history of St. Lucia, 7 times British, 7 times French,
Yes.
and the reparations due to the Kalamazoo people of St.
Yes.
Lucia. So it's going to be a very interesting debate for those of you who may not even know the history of St.
Of it,
Lucia or even
yes.
understand it.
Because we face it today, and as much as it was a long time ago, we still feel the repercussions today. So our young people will be telling us why they think that we should be discussing this bill.
And as we go forward, Ms. Rice, I just want to say to our people, let's be respectful in the comment sections, especially
Agreed.
For many young people here, it's actually their first time. For some of them, they are reoccurring faces. Sitting in the House of Parliament is not an easy thing. I
It's
remember
not.
my first time, I was a bit nervous, but as you get into it gradually, you will feel the momentum of our young people as they debate this very important bill. So what are your expectations?
Yes, so let's encourage them. I'm expecting to see some powerhouses because we know we have a lot of strong debaters here today. So I'm expecting them to put their best foot forward and bring the energy that they have been bringing so far.
Our youth are essential to the deliberations processes when it comes to this nation. They are the future. Some of you may even identify future candidates
Yes.
for your various constituencies. Our youth are fired up this morning. They are ready.
Agreed.
They've gone through 2 years of training. Some of them are again recurring faces. So be prepared to be blown off your feet because St. Lucian youth are the future and they know exactly the direction they want to go.
And you said the future. I believe the future is now. Most times we think of future as long term, but the future is now, and our youth are here now and they are ready.
And as I look out across the floor, I see many of them going through their notes. Many of them are speaking to their cabinet members to organize their viewpoints, organize their arguments, organize their direction of the conversation. Because my people, honestly and truly, we need to have a full house when we have youth parliament. We need to have the
Agreed.
benches full. We need to make sure that our youth are ready. And now we are beginning.
Prayers. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us here today. Guide our parliament with wisdom, unity, and understanding. Help us to make decisions that benefit our people and our nation. Grant us respect for one another and the strength to lead with honesty and compassion. Amen. Announcements. At this time, we would like to take a stand, a moment of silence, to honor the memory of our fallen youth. Thank you. You may have your seats. We would also like to extend condolences to the member for Denry South on the passing of a family member. Motion, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. The Reparatory Justice Resolution 2026. Whereas it is well established that both the French and British colonists fought the Kalinago for territory, and that while the indigenous population resisted European settlement for decades, that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, indigenous communities lost most of their land through warfare, colonial expansion, disease, and displacement, and were forced to flee to nearby islands or placed on a reservation in Dominica, and were replaced by enslaved Africans. And whereas it is well established that in 1772, in the decided case of Somerset and Stuart, noted that enslavement was outlawed in England, having been found contrary to the common law, and recalling that enslavement of individuals was nonetheless legal within the British colony empire, leading to the unjust, inhumane, and forced removal of over 12 million Africans from the African continent to the Western Hemisphere, while deeming these humans as property or chattel in the Barbados Code of 1661. And understanding the role that these enslaved individuals, deprived of humanity, liberty, rights, and an identity, played in the development of the early British and French colonies, the 18th century British economy, trade, and thereafter the financing of the European Industrial Revolution, which has definitively been linked as a driving force behind the present climate and environmental crisis, as well as the entrenching of its inhumanity and injustices into political, social, economic, and cultural institutions and systems globally. And cognizance of the impact that this brutal history has had on the underdevelopment of the Caribbean and African nations, including the long-standing and persistent erasure of culture, the impact on education systems, indigenous knowledge, the creation of generational wealth, technological advancement, the inequality of women, the destruction of the family, and the health of these nations. And recalling that the parliaments of the United Kingdom would discontinue the trading of enslaved individuals within the empire in 1807, while recollecting with concern that the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 guaranteed the right of freedom for the enslaved within the United Kingdom and its colonies, provided compensation only to the enslavers who deemed the enslaved as chattel rather than human beings deprived of freedom, including scores of enslavers within the then colony of St. Lucia, whose detailed financial claims remain within the annals of history. And further recalling that during that heinous period, 14 colonial wars were fought over St. Lucia, ensuring that the enslaved was 7 times British and 7 times French, conflicts which exacerbated the horrors of enslavement. And troubled by the continued societal issues that these chains of historical events have caused and have led to the United Nations 2001 declaration of that slavery and the slave trade are crimes against humanity and should have always been so, the effects of which we continue to manifest in structural inequality, underdevelopment, and racial injustice. and noting that on the 25th of March 2026, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution acknowledging that the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement was the gravest crime against humanity. Be it resolved, the Youth Parliament of St. Lucia, the Reparatory Justice Resolution Act, Resolution 2026, Clause 1, calls for the full and unreserved implementation of the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. Clause 2 urges the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues for reparations from both the French and British relating to the enduring socio-economic and environmental impacts of slavery, colonialism, including climate vulnerability. Clause 3 recommends the established National Reparations Committee coordinate all research, policy, and advocacy efforts on behalf of the government of St. Lucia. Clause 4 supports the development of legislation to govern the transparent management of any reparation resources. Clause 5 calls for a comprehensive education reform to include African and Caribbean history, cultural identity, and reparation awareness within school curricula. Clause 6 encourages national public education campaigns to raise awareness about the legacy of enslavement and its modern-day impacts. Clause 7 promotes youth engagement and leadership in reparations, advocacy, and decision-making process. Clause 8 supports the creation of funding mechanisms to invest in community development, education, and youth empowerment initiatives. Clause 9 encourages St. Lucia's foreign policy to align with regional and international efforts advocating for the reparatory justice. And be it further resolved that reparatory justice is a moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. Approved this day, the 26th of May, 2026. Honorable members of this Parliament, distinguished guests, and fellow citizens of St. Lucia on the island or in the diaspora, greetings to you all. Denrinoff, bonjour. Today we gather not as merely representatives of the youth, but as custodians of our history tasked with confronting shadows of a past that continues to shape our present. Members of this government have chosen to acknowledge how we show our past has shaped our present by wearing our madras in various ways, symbolizing the diversity, resilience, and cultural heritage born out of our shared history. We convene in the spirit of truth, justice, and responsibility to examine, understand, and act upon the enduring legacies of slavery, colonialism, systemic disenfranchisement that have long defined our nation and region. The history of St. Lucia is one that is etched in struggle and resilience. From the displacement of the Kalinago people who resisted European incursion only to be forced from their ancestral lands, to the repeated colonial contests that saw our island pass between the French and British hands 14 times. The narrative of our land is intertwined with the quest and brutal exploitation of human life. In the course of these conflicts, the lives of the enslaved and the indigenous were commodified and devalued, their labor fueling the wealth of European powers while leaving generations of St. Lucians with the legacy of underdevelopment, inequality, and social disruption. It is crucial, Mr. Speaker, to recall the lives lost and the freedoms denied. The account of the William Mutters family, 288 of whom were sold, torn from their homes, and treated as property, provides a scale to the staggering statistics of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. These were not mere numbers. These were mothers, fathers, children, stripped of identity and denied dignity. They were subjected to legal frameworks such as the Barbados Code of 1661, which codified the dehumanization of Africans as chattel, a stark reminder of systemic cruelty that underpinned our colonial past. And yet, with these oppressive conditions arose remarkable resilience. The enslaved women of St. Lucia, as documented in Stiffback Spine, displayed militancy, defiance, and an unwavering commitment to survival and communal solidarity. They resisted, they spoke, and they asserted their humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. Their courage is a testament to the indomitable spirit that courses through our nation and serves as a guiding light for our pursuit of justice today. Despite the 1772 Somerset case in England, which declared the enslavement law under common law, and the eventual passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, true freedom and justice was never extended to those who endured the atrocities of enslavement in St. Lucia. Compensation was granted to enslavers and not the enslaved. Mr. Speaker, usa imagine a moun ka futo ku. Et pite ou se ou ka hen la han, se moun la ki hen ku, se moun la ki bat ou se moun sa ka hen la han. Evidence kouan yo ba ou ka mouche a leko, me wadi ya, ou ka turn about, se l'histoire, se moun la ki bat yo ki hen la han. The enslavers were the ones who got paid instead of the enslaved. A historical inequity that left enduring scars on our society, economy, and cultural identity. Research, including June Sooner's work on the deconstructing emancipation in St. Lucia, highlights how the so-called freedom following emancipation often masked continued economic, social, and political subjugation. The legacy of colonialism did not end with the formal abolition of slavery. Rather, structural inequalities and systemic disenfranchisement persisted, and in many ways continue to this day. Mr. Speaker, members of the opposite may already be preparing to dismiss these calls for reparations with phrases such as, "Nobody is coming to save us," "Move on," "Reparations are too expensive," or "Be grateful that freedom came." I wish to address these arguments before they are even voiced. Our quest for reparatory justice is not about waiting for a savior. It is about claiming what is rightfully ours through moral, legal, and scholarly grounding. It is not a request for charity, but a pursuit of justice and restitution for historical wrongs. And the cost of justice cannot be measured merely in dollars. It must also be measured in fairness, dignity, and the opportunity to build a more equitable nation for generations to come. Gratefulness for freedom is not negated by the pursuit of reparations. In fact, true freedom demands that we confront and correct the inequities that have lingered long after emancipation. Those who argue that we should simply move on, I respond that moving on without reckoning with the past is not progress. It is a perpetuation of injustice. To those who say reparations are too expensive, I remind them that the price of inaction is the continued suffering and underdevelopment of our people. To those who claim freedom is enough, I assert that freedom without justice is incomplete, hollow, and insufficient. Mr. Speaker, some may even argue that the Africans themselves participated in the selling of enslaved persons, and therefore reparations are unjustified. However, European empires built and profited most from the slavery systems, and reparations seek justice for the lasting harm and inequality caused by colonial slavery. In most recent times, the global and regional reparation movement, though often dismissed by some as a ragtag collection of racial malcounts, have provided a critical framework for redressing these historical injustices. St. Lucia, like other CARICOM states, stands at the forefront of demanding accountability, restitution, and systemic reform. The 10-point plan for reparatory justice provides a roadmap for financial compensation, education, community investment, cultural restoration, and international advocacy. Here, the insights of our very own Sir Arthur Lewis must be acknowledged. Sir Arthur Lewis, whose scholarship on development economics shaped our understanding of the Caribbean's underdevelopment, emphasized that the enduring economic disparities faced by our nations are rooted in historical exploitation. His work supports the rationale for reparations, that justice is not merely moral, but economic and structural. Reparatory justice seeks to correct historical imbalances, restore dignity, and invest in the future of St. Lucia and the Caribbean. As your Minister of Finance, Justice, National Security, Constituency Development, and People Empowerment, I reassure you that reparatory justice must also be understood as a matter of national development, institutional strengthening, and social stability. The economic scars of slavery and colonialism are not abstract historical concepts. They are reflected in the unequal access to wealth, persistent poverty, youth unemployment, educational disparities, crime, and community vulnerability. Reparations, therefore, represent an opportunity to invest strategically in people-centered development through education reform, entrepreneurship initiatives, restorative justice programs, mental health support, cultural preservation, and community infrastructure. Furthermore, national security cannot be divorced from social justice. For societies burdened by generational inequity, often experienced by heightened instability and disenfranchisement. By pursuing reparatory justice, St. Lucia seeks not only acknowledgement of historical wrongs, but also the empowerment of communities, the strengthening of institutions, and the creation of a more secure, equitable, and economically resilient society. As a Youth Parliament of St. Lucia, we have a unique responsibility to translate these historical truths into meaningful actions. We must call upon our government to fully implement CARICOM 10-point plan, explore avenues for reparations from both the French and British governments, establish robust mechanisms for transparent management of reparation resources, and reform our education system to include comprehensive curricula on African and Caribbean history, cultural identity, and reparation awareness. We must engage our youth as active participants in decision-making, ensuring that the next generation is both informed and empowered to carry this work forward. Let us remember that reparations are not charity. They are legal, they are moral and historical obligations. They represent the recognition of the injustices endured, restitution for the harm done, and investment in future where freedom is not merely a concept, but a lived reality for all. Honorable members, our task is monumental, but our commitment must be unwavering. In acknowledging our past, the pain, the loss, the resilience, we chart a path forward that embodies justice, equity, and opportunity. We honor our ancestors whose voices were silenced, the women whose courage defied oppression, the generations yet to come who will inherit a St. Lucia and a Caribbean strengthened by truth and restored dignity. May this youth parliament serve as a beacon of moral leadership, scholarly rigor, and unwavering commitment to reparatory justice. Let us act, deliberate, and advocate with clarity, courage, and compassion, ensuring that legacies of slavery and colonialism are met with accountability, recognition, and lasting restitution. And with these words, Mr. Speaker, I definitely agree with the Reparatory Justice Resolution 2026. Thank you.
Honorable members, the question is that Youth Parliament 1 calls for the full and unreserved implementation of CARICOM 10-point plan. for reparatory justice. 2. Urges the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues for reparations from both the British and the French relating to the enduring socio-economic and environmental impact of slavery and colonialism, including climate vulnerability. 3. Recommend the established National Reparations Committee coordinate all research, policy, and advocacy efforts on behalf of the government of St. Lucia. 4. Support the development of legislation to govern the transparent management of any reparation resources. 5. Calls for the comprehensive education reform to include African and Caribbean history, culture, identity, and reparations awareness within school curricula. 6. Encourages national public education campaign to raise awareness about the legacy of enslavement and its modern day impacts. 7. Promote youth engagement and leadership in reparation advocacy and decision-making processes. 8. Support the creation of funding mechanisms to invest in community development, education, and youth empowerment initiatives. 9. Encourages St. Lucia foreign policy to align with regional and international efforts, advocacy and reparatory justice. And be it further resolved that reparatory justice is a moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. Member for Ancillary Canaries.
I rise today, Mr. Speaker and honorable members, to address an issue that strikes at the very heart of justice, identity, and historical truth in St. Lucia and across the Caribbean region. The question of reparations for slavery, native genocide, displacement, and colonial exploitation. Before I continue, however, please grant me, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity to extend my condolences to the family of Ms. Joyce Sentoma and to my constituents in Ancillary who are mourning the loss of a treasured, youthful, and active voice within the community. May the loved one she left behind find solace, knowing that in spite of her life being selfishly cut short, her voice will be echoed across generations. Mr. Speaker, let me first establish that the topic of reparations is not a narrow historical issue confined to academia or political symbolism. This matter extends far beyond the confines of memory and morality alone. And as Minister for External Affairs, International Trade, Civil Aviation, and Diaspora Affairs, let me make it abundantly clear that reparatory justice intersects directly with diplomacy. The international relations we maintain, economic development, trade, the systems within which small island developing states must compete, climate resistance, cultural identity, global mobility, the empowerment of our people at home and abroad, the vulnerabilities we continue to confront as a nation, and the future opportunities we seek to create for all our citizens. Hence, the topic of reparations is a serious matter of unfinished justice that has direct implications for the social and economic realities our people continue to face today. Our people are not asking for pity. We are demanding recognition. We are demanding that the international system acknowledge that the prosperity of former colonial powers was built in significant part through the exploitation of African labor and Caribbean resources that they are still today benefiting from. Mr. Speaker, the history of St. Lucia leading up to this very day is inseparable from the brutal machinery of colonialism. Our island changed colonial possession numerous times, 7 times British, 7 times French, as they have ingrained in our psyche, as if to parade this idea that it was done according to the wishes of our ancestors or to their benefit, when in fact, it was because European powers simply saw St. Lucia as an asset to be controlled and exploited. These plantation economies established during colonialism extracted enormous wealth from the region while leaving behind economic dependency, unequal development, racial inequality, structural inequalities, and impoverished generations whose effects remain evident across the Caribbean societies today. Yes, like Madam Prime Minister highlighted, when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834, it was not the enslaved who were compensated, it was the enslavers. The descendants of those who profited from slavery inherited land, wealth, assets, and institutions, and the descendants of the enslaved inherited structural disadvantages, poverty, underdevelopment, systemic inequality, and generations of economic exclusion. That, honorable members, is the historical debt we point to in such discourse. Now, Mr. Speaker, some, in fact many, may ask, why should the 7th generation, why should this parliament concern itself with events that occurred centuries ago? Even those from my constituency, a particular se gwamun la ki kamadi ki reparations. Ebe anu pale ati pawol. To the best of my abilities, let me try to put it into terms that you, the older folk, may be able to relate to. Mwen ase yo ya shaydi zon le zote piti, gwa maman ou te ka iba wol iswa kote fami ou ki jwen vole pa lot moun an vilaj la. Pitet osi ou jis leve ka hay jenerasyon se moun la ki pwe sa yo pate, ki pate sa yo. Par konte si fami ou wete pov, ek se vole a la ka viv douceman. Ou kay di mwen si sa pate kay afekte ou, ebe les ot moun an fami ou pate kay nearly de ou, yo tout se vole, piti kogo, ou te kay gade yo konsidere, yo tout koupab, ek franchement ou te kay vle yo, witoune tout sa fami ou pedi. Ebe, c'est kon sa, nou isi a jodi a, pou diskite ek pou demande justice by peyi nou. Nou tout sa maman Helen teni pou pedi diwa avek apre kolonizasyon. And to those, Mr. Speaker, who trivialize our worth and our right to demand reparations, I say we concern ourselves with this petty, irrelevant talk because the legacy of slavery did not end with emancipation. I may sound like a broken record at this point, but it needs to be repeated. The structures created by colonial rule continue to shape economic vulnerability, unequal access to opportunity, and the developmental limitations faced by Caribbean states today. When we speak about violence against women or against the marginalized, elevated crime rates, struggling healthcare system, limited access to development financing, or the development gaps that continue to affect Caribbean societies generations later, the educational inequalities, the economic fragility of small island developing states, unequal global trade systems, or even climate justice, we must understand that these conditions did not emerge in isolation. They are deeply connected to centuries of extraction and exploitation. They exist by design. Reparations, therefore, must be recognized as a developmental and moral imperative, as a contributing tool to this country's repayment. And for St. Lucia, reparatory justice is not simply about financial compensation. It also speaks to the importance of cultural restoration and historical truth. We must continue to teach our children not only the pain of our history, but also the resilience, brilliance, and contributions of our people. We are descendants not merely of victims, but of survivors and builders. Reparations are about investment in people, in education, healthcare, technology, infrastructure, climate adaptation, and economic opportunity. It is about correcting historical balance. It is about creating pathways for sustainable development and dignity. Speaking within my ministerial capacity, Mr. Speaker, on the relationship between civil aviation and reparations, we have an opportunity to rebuild the connections that were lost during that mass African displacement through cultural exchange, heritage tourism, educational cooperation, and stronger ties between the Caribbean, Africa, and our diaspora communities worldwide. We look over to our neighbors in Barbados who have been spearheading transnational initiatives that align with point 7 of the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparations, which speaks to knowledge exchange. Barbados just this month resumed monthly charter flights to Nigeria, and last year its Chamber of Commerce and Industry signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry to formalize private sector partnerships and to boost bilateral trade. In that same light, of course, I cannot ignore the significance of our own St. Lucian diaspora in this conversation. Across the Americas, Europe, and beyond, our diaspora communities are living testament to both the resilience of Caribbean people and the continuing impact of historical displacement. We talk about the issue of brain drain, ignoring that many of us have been forced to migrate in search of opportunities that have been historically denied to us at home. Yet despite these challenges, our diaspora continues immensely through immensely through remittances, investment, professional achievement, and advocacy for Caribbean interests abroad. Their success strengthens our nation, and their voices amplify the global call for justice and equity. In that regard, I believe reparations must also include stronger people-to-people partnerships, expanded educational exchange, investment in Caribbean innovation, and equitable access to global community opportunities. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that no nation can fully move forward while refusing to confront the foundations upon which inequalities were built. Genuine reconciliation requires acknowledgement, accountability, and action. In international diplomacy today, the world increasingly speaks the language of equity, inclusion, and historical accountability. If the global community can acknowledge reparative obligations in other contexts, then our call, the Caribbean's call, must also be treated with seriousness and legitimacy. We deserve no less. No mature democracy, no responsible international community can genuinely speak of human rights and justice while refusing to acknowledge one of the greatest crimes against humanity in recorded history and its enduring consequences. With that, permit me, Mr. Speaker, to remind this chamber that St. Lucia supported the UN resolution passed on the 25th of March this year, declaring that the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans was the greatest crime against humanity. Excuse me. Contrastingly, the main perpetrators contributing to these crimes abstain from casting a vote. Yes, the very ones who propagated 7 times British and 7 times French slogans refrain from simply acknowledging their involvement in this grave reality that in this sweet Helen of the West, generations have spent more years being enslaved than they have been free. Lest we not forget that one of those countries also stifled any progress for our brothers and sisters in Haiti for 140 years, because African men dared to demand their freedom. Unfortunately, though 8 decades have passed since Haiti paid off its debts, it is still today paying the price. As members of CARICOM, we owe a great deal of respect to the only people who successfully overthrew a colonial regime, who then went on to write its own constitution that permanently abolished slavery and established an enduring independent nation led by former slaves. It is through CARICOM that we will pay homage to Haiti by advancing this conversation and to elevate reparatory justice across all diplomatic platforms. Mr. Speaker, honorable members, we must all acknowledge that historical crimes create generational consequences. We must be truthful to ourselves, to who we are today, and where we come from, to recognize that the blood that runs through our veins still bears evidence of centuries of brutality. In that, we ought to affirm that international justice must have meaning not only in principle, but also in practice. This Parliament has a duty to support the original movement for reparatory justice, not merely as an act of remembrance, but as a strategic commitment to economic fairness, international equity, and sustainable development. Mamai Laslawe, Mamai Konawi, développement by Setlisi, c'est développement by nous toutes. Kachile asu développement pour les enfants, les teachers, les pêcheurs, les femmes, les riverdales. Avos tout le monde qui a travaillé. Nous pas commander pour la charité, nous commander pour bon nous, ça aïel nous, te bâti et pour. Indeed, we owe this to our ancestors who endured slavery. We owe it to the builders of modern St. Lucia who transformed suffering into nationhood. And we owe it to future generations who deserve to inherit not the unfinished burdens of colonialism, but the full promise of dignity, opportunity, and sovereignty. Thank you.
Member for Castries Southeast.
Sorry? Turn it off.
I'd like to begin by greeting everybody here. A good day. Fellow youth parliamentarians, invited guests. Mr. Speaker, we are all gathered here today, and I can't help but feel blessed. Blessed and proud. We have come so far as Caribbean people, and we have come such a long way as St. Lucians. And us being here today can only be accredited to the sacrifices made by our ancestors, Mr. Speaker. Their blood, their sweat, their tears, the scars left on their backs and the rest of their bodies, the scars left in their minds, Mr. Speaker, from the physical torture and abuse, the psychological manipulation and mental abuse, the pain, Mr. Speaker, the pain that we can never truly understand. All thanks to their strength and perseverance, Mr. Speaker, we can stand here today. And I'm grateful for this opportunity today to lend my voice to this CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. And I am here to say that I fully support this motion which seeks justice for the indigenous people and enslaved Africans who were dissociated from their homelands, only to be victimized by the greatest crime against humanity, the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Mr. Speaker, I really thought about it. I really took my time and I thought about it. I woke up in bed. I took a shower with clean water. I ate breakfast for my first meal of the day. This is supposed to be an average, bare minimum experience for a human being, right? Our enslaved ancestors didn't have beds. They seldom had sufficient food at any point in time. And being forced to labor in the unforgiving tropical sun, Mr. Speaker, they were rarely allowed to clean themselves properly after. This is the same sun that before we gather at an event for a party, everybody's under pressure trying to share a portable fan because why? Soleil show, right? Everybody's trying to find shade. But Mr. Speaker, our ancestors did not have that opportunity. They were forced to work 18 out of 24 hours in a day with no breaks, and any sign of letting down, they'd be abused again and again. Mr. Speaker, Imagine after an entire day of strenuous work in the quite literal blistering heat, all while suffering physical, mental, and psychological abuse. I boarded a bus this morning, Mr. Speaker, to go to work. Well, to come here. Somewhere along the way, the driver stops for somebody and they sit down by you. Right? Where you going with that stench so early in the morning? Right at that moment, it starts to rain. On top of that, the bus has no AC. We have to close the windows. And right there, that spoils your day. The 5 to 10 minute transit to get to work that day. Because one person sits next to you, right? But think of it that way, the transatlantic slave trade. We were transported, packed on slave ships like a tin of sardines. That's how they described it, Mr. Speaker. No space for breathing room. According to Louis 2026, so that the largest possible cargo may be carried, the captives were wedged below decks, chained to low-lying platforms, stacked in tiers with an average individual space of 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and perhaps 3 feet high. Unable to stand, unable to erect or turn over, many slaves died in this position, Mr. Speaker. If there were bad weather or any calms that prolonged the journey, the twice daily rotation of boiled rice, maybe some fermented yams or cornmeal, were reduced, resulting in near starvation and widespread illness among the enslaved. In the daytime, if the weather permitted, the slaves were brought on top deck for dancing or exercise, which was just simply forced jumping up and down, because yet still they were restrained to these decks so that they would not move or revolt. At this time, some captains would simply suggest cleaning the quarters, the same quarters where they were restricted and unable to move, where they were forced to urinate, defecate, and if they got seasick, regurgitate and soil themselves, Mr. Speaker. Imagine that. Deaths during the middle passage caused by epidemics, suicide, or mutiny have been estimated at a solid 13%. So many bodies were jettisoned, so much so that sharks would follow these ships to the Caribbean. Mr. Speaker, they were battered, bruised, mutilated, maimed, tortured, hanged, dragged by horses, crucified, hunted like wild animals for sport. The hatred ran so deep that they ingrained racial injustice into the legal systems so that the courts could support their twisted ideologies. They used religion to convince us that it was our destiny to be subservient tools and we deserved that type of mistreatment. And I'm supposed to stand here today and not support this 10-point plan, Mr. Speaker? How can I do that when given this platform? And Mr. Speaker, I really like this plan, because the colonizers want us to forget their sins. However, this plan combats their attempts by emphasizing the importance of developing our cultural institutions. Under my portfolio as Minister of Infrastructure, I recognize the brilliance of this plan by proposing combating misinformation by investing in museums, research centers, educational institutions, all to preserve and tell the history of slavery and colonialism. Museums and archives collect artifacts, documents, oral histories, music, language records, and traditions that might otherwise disappear. This protects cultural memory from being lost over time. The colonial education systems often minimize or distorted Caribbean and African history. Research centers help produce scholarly findings that help combat misinformation. They convince us that we sold our own people. Sometimes I hear people say that. They say, but in the first place, slavery existed in Africa. But what they don't explain is how we were conned and coaxed into inciting tribal wars along the coast of Africa and to sell our people to gain advantages in the forms of tools so that we may survive the onslaught coming in from Europe. But then again, Mr. Speaker, where do we access this information? And that is why this youth government, Mr. Speaker, is advocating for a free optimized online database containing our history that we may all access at our fingertips. We foresee that this development will be great for schools and research centers, for present and future historians as a means of publicizing research so that we may not perpetuate the false narratives indoctrinated into us by our oppressors. Mr. Speaker, the plan seeks to eradicate illiteracy. We need to strengthen our education systems and really fight this problem, which is a legacy of slavery, where education was denied to our people. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we've all heard the saying, and I don't particularly like it. If you want to hide something from a black person, put it in a book. Right? If you want to hide something from St. Lucians, put it in a book. I've heard people say that. Mr. Speaker, they purposely kept us from learning so that we may not communicate amongst each other, so that we will be less likely to coordinate revolts. It goes to show how deep the paranoia went, because if they knew that what they were doing were wrong. Sorry. It is because they knew that what they were doing was wrong that they had that paranoia, Mr. Speaker. And now it's all left up to us to repair our own society without help from the peripheral countries. But Mr. Speaker, how can we do that when we were built on exploitation and nothing more? CARICOM highlights that for 400 years, the trade and production policies of Europe could be summed up in the British slogan, "Not a nail is to be made in the Caribbean colonies." The Caribbean was denied participation in Europe's industrialization process, Mr. Speaker, and was confined to the role of producer and exporter of raw materials. This system was designed to extract maximum value from the region and to enable maximum wealth accumulation in Europe and only Europe. This has left us dry, Mr. Speaker, almost doomed to remain a third world country. Upon emancipation, it was the planters who were compensated, and that is because, provided by their law, the abolition of slavery meant that the planters were deprived of their property. And keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, the property that they are referring to is us, the people who look like me, look like you, and the rest of us inside of here. How fortunate we are that we were freed before that time, because it could have been us to be victimized the same way. Mr. Speaker, this meant that the wealth would not only lay with the planter class who owned the means of production, but it also meant that the now freed, now formerly enslaved, were left with nothing. And thus, to survive, they were forced to sell their labor for wages at the same plantations that they were held captive. These same plantations that were monopolized by the former planter class will now make up the upper class, enabling them to dictate lower class wages. Mr. Speaker, although I must acknowledge the progress that we have made as a country in terms of human rights in that regard, we can still see the lasting effects. As Minister of Infrastructure, I must highlight the undeniable fact that governments that emerged from slavery and colonialism have inherited the massive crisis of community poverty and institutional unpreparedness for development. These governments still daily engage in the business of cleaning up the colonial mess to prepare for further development. The pressure of development has driven governments to carry the burden of public employment and social policies designed to confront colonial legacies. This process has resulted in states accumulating unsustainable levels of public debt and now constitute their fiscal entrapment. We still do not have any real diversity in our manufacturing industries, Mr. Speaker. We are not self-sufficient, and tourism is our main source of income. It is evident that we are still dependent on the peripheral countries for development in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, this was shown by our 2020 pandemic, where we had no real means of economic development, that we were forced to open our borders for tourism in order to gain revenue and keep the country afloat. Mr. Speaker, our own Nobel laureate, scholar Sir Arthur Lewis blessed us with his thesis of industrialization through invitation, which we actively use today. However, let's look at what this has been developed into and who it truly caters to. Let's compare the development of our hotels in comparison to the development of our educational and medical institutions. The development trajectory of hotels in the Caribbean has generally outpaced the growth of medical and educational institutions, largely because tourism has been the dominant economic engine for many Caribbean economies. And common characteristics can be seen in such areas such as the heavy dependence on public funding, shortages of specialists and equipment, migration of healthcare professionals contributing to brain drain, and the concentration of advanced facilities in capital cities. And I'll elucidate a little bit on some of these points. The shortages of specialists and equipment. Due to our tertiary education not being properly developed, our students who want a better life are forced to seek education overseas, where they now have programs which implement our youth into their economies. Mr. Speaker, it's widespread that anywhere a St. Lucian goes, you see excellence. It could be in the medical field, engineering, but that's what they don't want us to hear. They don't want us to know that though. Mr. Speaker, the youth do not want to migrate, but we are left torn between a rock and a hard place. Should I develop my country, or should I fend for myself and find a better life? We do not want to leave our families and our peoples behind, but it's almost as if that is what we are left to do. Mr. Speaker, the concentration of advanced facilities in capital cities. Those from the rural areas, in case of emergency, need to travel so far to seek medical assistance. And yet still, in certain cases, we are still not able to access these features. Many times, people need to be airlifted to foreign countries so that they may seek medical assistance, and that is unfair. And that in itself is a burden left from colonialism. Mr. Speaker, that's why I absolutely must emphasize on the points where in this plan they provide access to modern technology and training to help Caribbean nations compete in the global market, while also cancelling and reducing international debt burden, recognizing that many Caribbean economies were built on exploitation. Mr. Speaker, this youth government is urging everybody to come together regardless of political affiliation, because this is a topic that affects all of us, our parents, our cousins, our children, and the future generations that we have not even thought about. Let us put together a fight that they cannot ignore so that we may be able to get these reparations and develop our country so that we may be self-sufficient and provide a better life for our citizens in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Member for Castries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, I extend greetings to the honorable members of this House and to the spectators in the gallery and online. Mr. Speaker, it is my distinct honor and high privilege to stand before you today as the representative for the people of Castries East, a resilient, hard-working and proud people whose unwavering spirit continues to rise above adversity and inspire hope across this nation. I also take a brief moment to extend my sincere appreciation to the former leader of the opposition for the principal standard she set in this honorable House. I intend to honor that standard today, though I suspect the members opposite will find my version considerably less comforting. Mr. Speaker, before the government performs their usual gymnastics, which I am sure they have spent considerable time rehearsing, before they attempt to dress this opposition in the costume of indifference, as though criticism of their motion is somehow equivalent to indifference towards our history, permit me to strip that argument bare. This opposition affirms unequivocally and without hesitation that repertory justice is a moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia. We do not dispute the brutality of slavery, nor do we dispute the centuries of documented theft of labor, of identity, of language, of culture, or of life. The United Nations General Assembly has now formally declared what we, the descendants of the enslaved, have always known, that the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans was the gravest crime against humanity in recorded history. This honorable opposition stands on that declaration, fully and unapologetically. So let the members opposite devoid themselves of that particular absurdity from the outset. Mr. Speaker, the question before this House is not whether reparations are owed. They are. The real question before us is whether the members opposite have produced a document serious enough to actually pursue them. And after reading this motion, with the care it so apparently and abhorrently was not written with, I am compelled to conclude that the government has placed before this Parliament not a strategy for justice. This motion is a combination of buzzwords, flowery language, and established facts aimed at pulling at heartstrings as opposed to an implementable policy. Mr. Speaker, let me begin where the government's thinking first goes wrong, and it goes wrong very early. The motion recalls the Slavery Abolition Act of 1843 in language that at best reflects a dangerously incomplete reading of history, and at worst perpetuates the very colonial narrative we should be dismantling. The Slavery Abolition Act did not guarantee freedom for the enslaved. It guaranteed compensation to the enslavers. The British Parliament distributed £20 million sterling at the time, approximately 40% of the entire annual budget, not to the men and women who had endured the whip, the chain, the branding iron, forced separation, and the systematic erasure of their humanity. They gave it to the very men who held those whips. And then, Mr. Speaker, they forced the formerly enslaved to continue working unpaid for their former enslavers for up to 6 additional years into what they coined the apprenticeship system. Let that sit with the members opposite for a moment. The enslaved paid twice, once through their labor and again through their continued servitude. Yet, Mr. Speaker, this government wishes to brazenly recall this legislation as having freed them. Mr. Speaker, I say to the government, strike that clause. Strike it from this motion and replace it with something worthy of the people you claim to represent. Do not ask this Parliament to stand in the shadow of British legislation, as though Westminster's eventual moral discomfort constitutes a gift to our ancestors. Freedom was not gifted, it was demanded. It was fought for in forests and on plantations, and in the stubborn, unbreakable refusal of people who would not let colonialism own their souls, even when it owned their bodies. Draft instead a St. Lucian Freedom Declaration, one that places the agency of our ancestors at the center of our national repertory posture. This is what this moment requires, and this government has failed to produce it. Mr. Speaker, while we are correcting the government's framing, I must challenge another habit embedded in this motion. The habit of describing St. Lucia's history as though we are nothing but a footnote in a European territorial dispute. The motion asks this House to recall this island as having been 7 times British and 7 times French, as though that alone defines who we are. I reject that framing as profoundly insufficient. St. Lucia was not merely a colonial trophy passed between empires. St. Lucia was a sanctuary for resistance. Kwashiba escaped Barbados and found her way to Mikud. Janet fled Martinique and found refuge on this island's terrain. These were not accidents. These were deliberate acts of resistance. People choosing this land as the site for their defiance. And this land receiving them, Mr. Speaker. That is our history too. And it belongs in any document that dares to speak about reparatory justice on our behalf. A nation that approaches reparatory justice from the posture of a colonial trophy negotiates very differently from one that approaches from the posture of a sanctuary of resistance. And that, Mr. Speaker, matters beyond symbolism. Mr. Speaker, because when this government describes St. Lucia as territory that passed between empires, it hands Britain and France the deflection they most want. That what happened here was governance, however flawed, of a people who were theirs. But Kwashiba did not flee to British territory. Janet did not seek refuge under French jurisdiction. Their presence on this land was itself a repudiation of colonial authority. Proof that the empire's claim over the people of this land was never total and never consented to. A reparatory demand rooted in that history is not a complaint about how we were governed. It is a claim made by people who were violated beyond the boundaries of any jurisdiction they ever accepted. And that is a categorically stronger legal and moral position. The government's framing surrenders it without a second thought, and this opposition categorically rejects it. But Mr. Speaker, if the government's framing of emancipation is troubling, and it is, then their erasure of specific St. Lucians from this motion is nothing short of a moral failure. The members opposite, including the member for Castries Southeast, leans heavily on the CARICOM 10-point plan, as though regional alignment is a substitute for national specificity. It is not. CARICOM's framework is historically important. I will not diminish that. But a motion drafted by the government of St. Lucia for the people of St. Lucia that cannot name a single St. Lucian ancestor is not national policy. It is a regional pamphlet with a St. Lucian letterhead. So, Mr. Speaker, allow this 5-member opposition to do what the larger but weaker government could not. In 1843, on the Fodder Estate, there was a woman named Petronille. Petronille refused to work. Not because she could not, because she understood that refusing was one of the only acts of sovereignty still available to her. And for that refusal, for the simple, defiant assertion of her own will, Petronille was killed. Killed on St. Lucian soil. Killed in the same year that the British Parliament was preparing to compensate her enslaver for murdering her. This one example can be extrapolated across the shores of our history. The government speaks about enslaved women as a broad demographic. Petronille was not a demographic. She was a St. Lucian woman, and she deserves at absolute minimum to be named. Mr. Speaker, as we know, slavery was not gender neutral, and any motion that treats it as though it was is not serious about the harm it claims to redress. Black women under chattel slavery occupied a uniquely brutal position like all enslaved persons. Their labor was extracted, and simultaneously their bodies were commodified in ways that have no equivalent. Their reproductive capacity was treated as a plantation asset. Forced reproduction, sexual violence, and the separation of mothers from children they bore were not aberrations of the plantation system. They were instruments of it. And Mr. Speaker, the echoes of that system did not die with emancipation. Many of the gendered patterns of violence, vulnerability, and institutional neglect that women confront today descend from those same structures. That is why any serious conversation on reparatory justice must also confront violence against women as part of the living legacy of enslavement. Mr. Speaker, every woman in this House, in the gallery, or online understands something no piece of legislation has yet resolved. They know the feeling of checking a phone, of calculating a route home, of asking loved ones to stay on the phone with them whilst they try to make their way home. That quiet, constant, exhausting vigilance is not personal weakness. It is inherited knowledge passed down by women who learned across centuries that this island's institutions were not built to protect them. Reparatory justice does not urgently begin the domestic work required to dismantle that inheritance is not justice for the women of this nation. Mr. Speaker, history ceases to be theoretical when we place a name beside the suffering. And so let us speak about Alexandrine Alexandre, who worked on the Roseau estate. Alexandrine was 31 years old. She was deaf, she was mute, and she was forced to toil in the cane gang. Mr. Speaker, picture that clearly. A deaf and mute woman, 41 years of age, cutting sugarcane in the Caribbean sun for the profit of her enslaver, who would later be compensated by the crown for the inconvenience of her freedom. The plantation system did not distinguish, and it did not make accommodations. It extracted from everyone within its reach, regardless of physical condition, and discarded those it could no longer use. This motion contains not a single clause addressing the intersection of disability and colonial exploitation. Not one provision connects the deliberate mutilation of enslaved bodies to the infrastructural exclusion that persons with disabilities continue to experience today. Mr. Speaker, I turn now to what I consider the most telling phrase in this entire motion, and it is found in clause 2. The government urges St. Lucia to explore avenues for reparations. Explore avenues, Mr. Speaker? Those two words tell you everything you need to know about the seriousness, or rather the lack thereof, with which this document was constructed. After 12 million Africans forcibly removed from their homes, after centuries of chattel slavery that financed European industrialization, after decades of Caribbean scholarship, regional advocacy, and international legal argumentation, after all of that, the government sat down, put pen to paper, and urges St. Lucia to explore avenues. I genuinely do not know whether to be offended or embarrassed on their behalf. So, Mr. Speaker, I have settled to do both. Mr. Speaker, Sir Arthur Lewis was born in Castries. He grew up on this island, won a scholarship to London, and at 24 years old, before the Nobel Prize, before the knighthood, before he built the Caribbean Development Bank from the ground up, he had already settled the question this government is apparently still struggling to articulate. In 1939, he wrote, "It is the British who, by their action in past centuries, are responsible for the presence in these islands of the majority of their inhabitants, whose ancestors as slaves contributed millions to the wealth of Great Britain, a debt which has yet to repay." That is not an exploration of avenues, Mr. Speaker. That is a demand, written by a St. Lucian in 1949. This government inherited 87 years of scholarship, a Nobel laureate's moral clarity, and the full weight of documented history, and still managed to produce a motion so timid that it reduces reparatory justice to an administrative scavenger hunt. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the 24-year-old Sir Arthur Lewis demonstrated more intellectual courage with a pen in 1939 than this entire government has demonstrated through this motion in 2026. Mr. Speaker, avenues have already been mapped. The Brattle Group report has estimated the global repertory debt of enslavement at $107.8 trillion. We are not entering a negotiation empty-handed. We are not entering it with a bill that has already been written, a debt that has already been calculated, and evidence that has already been compiled. And the government's response to all of that reparation, Mr. Speaker, again, is to urge St. Lucia to explore avenues.
Honourable Member, you have 5 minutes remaining.
We are not geographers searching for a road already paved. This motion must be revised to explicitly adopt those quantified economic figures as the baseline for St. Lucia's repertory demand, not an exploration, not an inquiry, not a dialogue, a demand. However, Mr. Speaker, this opposition understands that the extraction of our ancestors cannot be repaired by capital alone.
Honourable Member, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I have 15 minutes. How much time will you give me?
Member, my clock is ticking as well. You have 5 minutes remaining.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, since this government has chosen to introduce France in this motion scope, this House cannot discuss repertory justice without confronting Haiti. After Haitian revolutionaries defeated Napoleon's forces and established the first black republic in the modern world, France did not respond with recognition. France set an invoice. Haitians were compelled to pay 150 million gold francs in reparations to French enslavers for the crime of liberating themselves, plunging the nation into generations of debt and developmental stagnation in ways that remain visible and measurable today. That history matters because the government cannot engage with France on repertory justice while pretending that precedent does not exist. Mr. Speaker, permit to speak briefly but directly to the young people of St. Lucia. Many young St. Lucians today are tired in a way that transcends politics, tired of hearing about a system designed against them without being shown a credible path through it, tired of watching the cost of living outpace opportunity, tired of making the calculation between staying and living and finding the arithmetic increasingly difficult to argue against. And sometimes historical debates in Parliament feel very distant from that daily reality. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that the members opposite brought that point up. Because when they spoke, Mr. Speaker, for a moment I thought maybe they were on this side of the House. The members form the government, yet the Minister for Infrastructure references persons being far away from essential care and resources that they need. Member, where is your budget? The Prime Minister speaks about persons going abroad, Mr. Speaker, to find opportunity. Then, Madam Prime Minister, where is your vision? Why are persons leaving this nation? Mr. Speaker, Frederick Douglass did not offer the world a polite observation when he said that power concedes nothing without a demand. He issued an instruction. And today I issue it directly to the members opposite. Stop dressing historical theft in the language of diplomatic inquiry. Stop producing motions that sound revolutionary inside this chamber and dissolve into ambiguity outside of it. Petronil was not murdered politely. Alexandria did not endure the King Gang politely. Kwashiba did not flee Barbados with politeness as her compass. Our ancestors made their demands with everything they had, with their bodies, with their defiance, with their refusal to disappear. And the very least we owe them is to approach the justice owed in their memory with the same uncompromising resolve they demonstrated in pursuit of their own survival. The descendants of enslaved Africans in St. Lucia will not again accept a motion that asks for justice in a whisper. This opposition will not accept it, and today we put this government on notice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Castries-North.
Mr. Speaker, honorable members of this House, and listeners both here and online, I bid you all a pleasant good morning. allow me to extend my deepest condolences to the family of Darian Roberts, a young man from my constituency who was heavily involved in youth development through sports, dance, national volleyball, and coach. I rise today as the parliamentary representative for Castries North and the Minister of Equity, Labor, Gender and Elderly Affairs, Social Justice and Consumer Welfare to contribute to this debate on reparatory justice, a matter rooted in fairness, dignity, and the collective responsibility to address the enduring consequences of historical injustice. Like my Prime Minister said, reparatory justice is the process of acknowledging and repairing the long-term harm caused by slavery, colonialism, and systematic exploitation. It is based on a simple principle where injustice has created generational harm. Justice requires meaningful redress. Across the Caribbean, the legacy of enslavement remains visible in economic disparities, social inequalities, and barriers to development. These are not merely issues of history. They are realities that continue to shape our present. The Caribbean has advanced this cause to the CARICOM Reparations Commission and its 10-point plan for reparatory justice. This framework outlines practical areas for restorative action, including a formal apology, debt cancellation, public health initiatives, educational support, technology transfer, and economic development. It recognizes that reparations are not limited to compensation. They are fundamentally about restoring the capacity of Caribbean nations to achieve sustainable development. This aligns directly with the right to development, the principle that every people must have the opportunity to participate in and benefit from economic, social, cultural, and political progress. The Caribbean's development was interrupted by systems designed to extract wealth from our region while denying our people the resources to prosper. Reparatory justice seeks to address that imbalance and create the conditions for equitable advancement. In this regard, the work of Sir Arthur Lewis remains highly relevant. Sir Arthur Lewis emphasized that underdevelopment in former colonies was not accidental but engineered. Colonial systems transferred wealth to Europe while restricting industrial and social advancement in the Caribbean societies. His analysis makes clear that many of the structural challenges our region faces today are rooted in historical exploitation. This strengthens the call for reparations because it confirms that the inequalities we confront were created by policy and not by circumstance. The Brattle report further reinforces this position. It highlights how the profits through slavery significantly contributed to the economic development of former colonial powers while leaving Caribbean societies with the burden of underdevelopment. This evidence supports what our region has long maintained. The wealth of empires was built on the labor of enslaved people, while the descendants of those same people were left to overcome the consequences with limited means. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister for Equity, Labor, Gender and Elderly Affairs, I must also highlight that one of the earliest documented calls for reparatory justice was made by a woman, Belinda Sutton. An African woman enslaved in the United States petitioned in 1783 for compensation for years of unpaid labor. Her petition is widely recognized as one of the first formal reparations claims in recorded history. This itself is significant. It reminds us that women have long been central to the pursuit of justice, even when their contributions have been overlooked. As a ministry committed to gender equity and social inclusion, it is important to recognize that the struggle for reparatory justice has also been shaped by the courage of women who demanded recognition, fairness, and dignity. Belinda Sutton's petition was not only a personal claim. It was an early assertion that exploitation must be acknowledged and repaired. That history is especially meaningful because reparatory justice is inseparable from social justice. The systems established during slavery affected labor, family structures, access to education, health, and wealth distribution. Those impacts continue to influence vulnerable groups today, including women, children, the elderly, and marginalized communities. Addressing historical injustice, therefore, supports the broader work of building an equitable society for all. Members of the opposing side may contend that slavery was legal during its time and therefore should not be judged by today's standards. However, legality does not determine morality. There have been many laws throughout history that were legal and yet profoundly unjust. Slavery stripped human beings of their freedom, dignity, basic rights, reducing lives to property for profit. It violated every moral principle of humanity and compassion. By today's international standards and by any reasonable ethical standard, slavery was a crime against humanity. And the fact that it was once lawful does not lessen the suffering it caused or the responsibility to address its lasting consequences. Reparatory justice is not about division. It is about restoration. It is about acknowledging truth and ensuring the historical harm is addressed through meaningful partnerships and policy. It is about giving Caribbean people the opportunity to achieve the level of development that was once denied to previous generations. Mr. Speaker, reparations are not a request for sympathy. They are a call for justice. The 10-point plan offers a practical pathway. Sir Arthur Lewis gave us the intellectual framework. The Brattle report provides economic evidence. And Belinda Sutton, she reminds us that the demand for justice began long ago, led by individuals who understood that freedom without repair was incomplete. As representatives of the people, we must continue to support this cause. Reparatory justice is about securing fairness for our region, dignity for our ancestors, and opportunity for future generations. I thank you.
Member for Mikudnov.
Mr. Speaker, distinguished members of Parliament, fellow youth parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Mr. Speaker, before I proceed further, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the people of my constituency, Mikud North, for placing their trust and confidence in me to represent them in this honorable house. Modizot a shy Messi. I say to you all, thank you very much. It is truly a privilege and an honor to stand here today as your voice. Mr. Speaker, I invite every person in this chamber to pause, not physically, but mentally, and reflect on a reality that shaped the foundation of our Caribbean civilization. Imagine waking up before sunrise, not because you choose to, but because chains around your ankles leave you no choice. Imagine hearing the cries of mothers separated from their children. Imagine being forbidden to speak your language, practice your culture, or even call yourself fully human. Imagine generations growing up knowing hardship before hope, punishment before peace, and survival before freedom. Now imagine that suffering enduring not for days or years, but for centuries. That, Mr. Speaker, was the brutal reality of enslavement. And although slavery was abolished, its consequences were never abolished. Emancipation removed the chains from our ancestors' hands, but did not immediately dismantle the systems of inequality, poverty, exclusion, and underdevelopment that slavery created. Because history does not simply vanish. Saki passe toujours kafe further nous. What has happened in the past still lives within us. Mr. Speaker, far too often, reparatory justice is misunderstood. Some dismiss it as an attempt to dwell on history. But reparatory justice is not about remaining imprisoned by the past. It is about understanding how the past continues to influence present realities. Why do some communities continue to experience generational poverty? Why are so many young people vulnerable to crime and violence? Why do inequality, exclusion, and social instability persist across many Caribbean societies? Why are vulnerable groups still struggling to receive equal treatment and opportunities? The answer is rooted in history. The Caribbean did not begin on equal footing with the developed world. Our ancestors generated immense wealth for colonial empires while remaining dispossessed themselves. They cultivated lands they would never own, built economies they would never benefit from, and endured unimaginable brutality so others could prosper. Yet, despite every attempt to break them, our ancestors survived. They resisted oppression, they preserved culture, they fought for our dignity. And today, the resilience lives within every one of us. We are the children of people who stood strong. Mr. Speaker, reparatory justice is not just a historical discussion to me. It is personal. It is something I grew up hearing in conversations with elders and within my own household. I was raised in a Rastafarian home, where we were constantly reminded that the struggles Caribbean people face today did not begin with us. They are deeply rooted in the history of slavery, colonialism, oppression, and the continued inequalities passed down through generations. My father himself is an example of this painful reality. He was deprived of a full education and was only able to attend school until grade 5. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked ambition, but because inequality and circumstance forced him out of the classroom at an early age. That story is not unique. It reflects the reality of many Caribbean families whose opportunities were limited because of systems created long ago during colonial rule. Generations were left without land, without wealth, without access to quality education, and many families are still fighting to recover from those disadvantages today. Mr. Speaker, growing up in a Rastafarian household also allowed me to witness another form of injustice that still exists in our society. In St. Lucia, Rastafarians have often been misunderstood, stereotyped, and discriminated against because of their appearance, beliefs, and way of life. Many Rastafarian men and women have faced ridicule for wearing their locks, have struggled to gain acceptance in schools and workplaces, and are sometimes unfairly associated with criminality simply because of their faith and culture. Children from Rastafarian families have experienced discrimination within educational institutions, being made to feel different or unwelcome because of how they look or what they believe. As a young person raised in this environment, I learned early that reparatory justice is about truth, recognition, healing, and opportunity. It is about breaking cycles of poverty, discrimination, and exclusion that were created centuries ago but still affect Caribbean people today. And if we truly want to build safer communities, reduce crime, strengthen families, and empower our youth, then we must first acknowledge the wounds that history has left behind and work together to heal them. Mr. Speaker, reparatory justice is therefore not simply a conversation about compensation. It is a conversation about restoration. Restoration of dignity, restoration of opportunity, restoration of communities, restoration of hope. For over 400 years, millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homeland, stripped of their identity, denied their humanity, and subjected to brutal enslavement. Men, women, and children were treated as property rather than people. Families were separated, cultures were erased, and generations were forced to labor under inhumane conditions for the economic benefit of colonial powers. Here in the Caribbean, including St. Lucia, colonial wealth and development were built upon the backs of enslaved Africans. The pain and injustice experienced during enslavement did not disappear after emancipation. Instead, its effects created cycles of poverty, inequality, social division, violence, and limited opportunities that many communities still struggle with today. Mr. Speaker, this discussion is especially important when considering the work of the Ministry of Home Affairs, Crime Prevention, Persons with Disabilities, and Conflict Resolution. The issues handled by this ministry are directly connected to the long-term effects of historical injustice. Today, those injustices continue to echo throughout Caribbean societies. Reparatory justice, therefore, cannot be viewed as a conversation about the past alone. It is a conversation about the future. It is about investing in stronger education systems, affordable housing, youth development programs, mental health services, economic opportunities, and social protection for communities that have historically been neglected. Justice means ensuring that every citizen, regardless of background, has a fair opportunity to succeed. Mr. Speaker, when we speak about crime prevention, we must also confront the historical realities that contribute to modern social problems. Across many societies, crime is often connected to hopelessness, unemployment, trauma, inequality, and social neglect. Many young people involved in violence or criminal activity emerge from environments shaped by generations of hardship and limited opportunities. This does not excuse criminal behavior, but it reminds us that punishment alone cannot solve crime. We can also wrest our way out of problems that were centuries in the making. If generations were denied opportunities because of enslavement and colonial oppression, then modern societies have a responsibility to create systems that uplift and empower future generations. As youth parliamentarians, we must advocate for policies that build people rather than simply punish them. Mr. Speaker, a society cannot claim to pursue justice while some of its citizens remain excluded and unheard. During slavery and colonialism, human worth was often measured by physical labor and economic productivity. Those considered weak, disabled, or different were frequently neglected, excluded, or dehumanized. Even in modern society, many persons with disabilities continue to face barriers to equal participation. Too often, they are denied access to opportunities in education, employment, transportation, leadership, and public life. Reparatory justice, therefore, demands inclusion. It calls for accessible schools, inclusive workplaces, equal employment opportunities, improved public facilities, and stronger support systems for persons with disabilities. Justice cannot exist if members of society continue to be overlooked simply because they are different. Mr. Speaker, one of the most dangerous legacies of slavery and colonialism is division. Division based on race, class, status, and power. These divisions planted seeds of distrust, inequality, and social tension that still affect societies today. Reparatory justice is therefore also about healing. Healing requires dialogue, healing requires accountability, healing requires empathy, and healing requires unity. Conflict resolution becomes essential if we are serious about building peaceful communities and sustainable national development. Young people, in particular, must be equipped to resolve disagreements through communication, mediation, and restorative approaches rather than violence and division. Because true national progress cannot exist without social cohesion. Mr. Speaker, our generation now carries a profound responsibility. We are the generation called to confront uncomfortable truths. We are the generation called to challenge inequality. We are the generation called to transform inherited pain into purposeful progress. Reparatory justice is not about seeking sympathy. It is about pursuing fairness. It is about restoring dignity where dignity was denied. It is about creating opportunities where barriers once existed. It is about empowering marginalized communities. It is about building a society where every citizen, regardless of background, status, or ability, has the opportunity to thrive. Nous kaidu boutasam, parce que force nous c'est l'idée. We will stand together because our strength is in unity. And so today, Mr. Speaker, I rise not merely to speak about the wrongs of the past, but about the responsibilities of the present and the possibilities of the future. Because reparatory justice is not simply about where we come from, it's about where we are going. Thank you.
Member for Grosile.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, honorable members, seated guests, and listeners. Today, I speak to add my voice to this historic discussion, and I do so in the capacity of Minister for Tourism, Commerce, Investment, Creative Industries, Culture and Heritage, and the member for Grosile. I speak with an immense sense of gratitude to the people who anchor my presence in this legislative chamber. To my hardworking constituents of Grosile, your trust is the exact mandate that drives my advocacy here today. Mr. Speaker, let there be absolute clarity from the onset. I stand in total unreserved agreement with the government's position to adopt this resolution, properly titled the Resolution for Full and Unreserved Implementation of the CARICOM 10-Point Plan for Reparatory Justice. But let us strip away the sanitizing veil of diplomatic jargon and address the raw reality of this matter. When we speak of reparations under the purview of my ministry, we are not negotiating for tokenistic gestures. We are not interested in hollow, symbolic handshakes from Europe, and we are certainly not petitioning for direct monetary disbursements. True reparatory justice cannot be bought in a transient one-off payout that serves to only cheapen the ancestral blood spilled on our soil, while leaving the underlying structural chains completely intact. You cannot absorb 300 years of systematic human destruction with a mere cash transaction. We must render this undeniable truth easy to comprehend for the average St. Lucian listening to this broadcast. Consider this reality. When an international visitor arrives on our ports of entry, we pride ourselves on delivering a world-class luxury experience. Yet, we must confront a glaring economic contradiction. Why is it that foreign conglomerates claiming to invest in our island repatriate vast multi-million-dollar profit margins to West capitals, while fundamental human capital, our hotel workers, our local entertainers, our musicians, and our creative practitioners are left to subsist on unlivable wages? This disparity is not a matter of mere economic misfortune, Mr. Speaker. It is the direct linear consequence of the transatlantic slave trade, because racialized chattel enslavement stripped our ancestors of their land, monopolized global capital, and systematically barred us from developing diversified, independent domestic industries. Our population was left with zero structural alternatives. We were forcefully funneled into compliance with the tourism industry as a basic mechanism for national survival. We did not select this singular economic trajectory out of organic preference. We were structurally trapped within it. Furthermore, we must account for the severe psychological, behavioral, and developmental strain this compromise continues to inflict upon our citizenry. Operating within the tourism and creative sectors under these conditions too often demands a devastating erosion of self and identity. Our people are systematically placed on display, compelled to perform for the foreign gaze, and trapped within the industrial loop where hospitality is routinely manipulated until it mimics the forced servitude of the colonial great house. We are here today to declare that our culture is not a commodity for performance. Our people are not props for external amusement, and true reparatory justice must fund the economic, structural, and psychological liberation of every creative hospitality worker in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, let us delve directly into the core structural realities governed by my portfolio. Because the mechanisms of tourism, commerce, and investment in modern St. Lucia cannot be understood without pulling back the curtain on our past. When we look at the third and fourth clauses of this resolution, we are not looking at dead ink on old parchment paper. We are looking at the economic blueprint that designed our present struggles. I stand here to declare to this honorable House and to every citizen listening to this broadcast that our contemporary over-reliance on the tourism sector is not an organic commercial choice. It is not a free market preference where we select our pure desire. It is a calculated historical trap of forced compliance. Colonial exploitation deliberately prevented us from establishing a diversified domestic manufacturing base or independent commercial industry. Our island was left with zero structural alternatives when we gained political independence. We were forcefully funneled into compliance with the hospitality sector as a basic mechanism for national survival. We did not select this singular economic trajectory. We were once again structurally trapped within it from the very moment the sugar mill stopped spinning. Now, Mr. Speaker, as for the interjections from persons may bring onto this floor, textbook economic scripts and anti-investment accusations will not move me. Any claim that by demanding reparatory justice, we are threatening the fragile confidence of international markets, disrupting foreign affairs, or scaring away foreign direct investments will be shut down. The public should not be led to believe that we must remain silent, submissive, and perpetually grateful just to keep our economy afloat. Let us look at the human capital in St. Lucia. The people working right now under the purview of my ministry who are listening to this discussion at home right now. I am speaking directly to the room attendants waking up at 4 a.m. to clean luxury suites in Rodney Bay. I am speaking to local entertainers, the musicians, the steel pan players, and the dancers who sweat under the hot sun to perform our culture for foreigners. I am speaking to the taxi drivers navigating the roads from Hiranora to the north, and the local vendors trying to secure a small space on the beach to sell their craft. Why is it that the very people who form the absolute unyielding backbone of this five-star industry are left to subsist on borderline unlivable wages? Why does our local capital feel secondary to foreign capital? This is why, under point 2 and point 8 of this resolution, reparatory justice cannot look at a transient tokenistic cash handout. We are building a robust legislative framework, not seeking charity or one-time payout that leaves the broken system completely intact. True reparations must materialize as permanent, legislated funding mechanisms. We are not demanding resources from the British and the French to invest directly in local community development, to restructure our community architecture, and demanding resources to accessible capital for youth entrepreneurship. And we are trying to finally break this generational loop of economic dependency. We want to ensure that the wealth generated in St. Lucia stays within the hands of St. Lucians and St. Lucians alone. Mr. Speaker, I turn now to the cultural and creative arms of my ministry. The fourth clause of this resolution, explicitly laminates that the long-standing and persistent erasure of our culture has been inflicted on our people from day one. We must possess the institutional courage to confront the deep psychological and behavioral toll that this economic compromise continues to impose on our creative practitioners. Operating within a structural framework that is completely dependent on a foreign demographic too often demands a devastating erosion of self, identity, and dignity. Our local entertainers are routinely expected to alter, sanitize, and perform our sacred cultural heritage simply to satisfy an external market. Let us call it what it is. It is an institutional loop where hospitality is systematically manipulated. It echoes a painful era where our ancestors were put on display and forced to perform for the amusement of the planter class. Individuals may try to minimize the statements I make today with likely arguments that culture does not pay the bills or that we should focus on hard economics instead of dwelling on identity and heritage. Some may say reparations should only focus on physical infrastructure. To critics, I say, a nation that does not know its own identity cannot defend its own pockets. Our culture is an unyielding testament to our historical survival. It is not a cheap commodity for external performance. Our people are creative innovators. They are not props for foreign amusement. Therefore, when we invoke point 5 and point 6 of this resolution, we are demanding the resources to fund comprehensive education reform and aggressive public awareness campaigns. Reparatory justice means funding the decolonization of the mind. It builds sovereignty, cultural hubs, theaters, and independent creative industries where St. Lucians can create for themselves first, fully rooted in their true history and completely free from the psychological strain of the foreign gaze. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must recognize that our push for reparatory justice is not a passive plea for charity, nor is it a sign of weakness. It is a direct continuation of the same unyielding legacy of ancestral resistance. Research from our National Reparations Committee reminds us that our freedom was never a benevolent gift or an act of mercy from a European parliament. It was fought for, bled for, and won through the raw, uncompromised militancy of our people on the ground in St. Lucia. But let me ask this House, how can we move forward when the wealth extracted from our ancestors is still sitting in the banks of Europe, generating interest for foreign entities, while our school curricula still omit our own triumphs? How can we move forward when the generational trauma remains visible in our workforce? To give true name, shape, and form to this struggle, we must enshrine our ancestors deeply into our official records of this Parliament. We speak today for the stiff-backed women of St. Lucia, immortalized in our literature, who flatly refuse to comply with an oppressive system. We speak today for Petronille, who was brutally killed on April 11, 1833, at the Four-Door Estate because she looked her oppressor in the eye and completely refused to work. We speak for Clotilde, who was severely whipped because she refused to cut grass on a Sunday. She knew her rights under the law. She took her case to stipendiary magistrate, and she stood so unwillingly in her firm defiance that her own estate manager, Mr. Dubocage, was forced to declare in absolute frustration that this black woman would not do a thing for me. Mr. Speaker, these women carried an unbreakable spine. They refused to lose their identity, and they refused to forcefully comply. As the Youth Parliament of St. Lucia, we stand squarely on point 7 of this resolution to declare that we inherit the same unyielding stiff-backed spine. The behavioral, economic, and psychological strain of this colonial legacy stops with our generation. We are here to protect our human capital, to reclaim our heritage, and ensure that our national sovereignty is made absolute in every way possible. Mr. Speaker, as I draw my contributions to a close, let me speak directly to the members sitting in the benches opposite. There are times in political life when the adversarial nature of this honorable House serves the democracy of St. Lucia. We can argue over fiscal policies, we can debate infrastructural contracts, we can clash over the management of routine administrative bills. That is the necessary, vibrant nature of the Westminster democracy. Today is not one of those days. The issue of reparatory justice rises far above the narrow, colorful boundaries of political parties. When we look at the text in this resolution, we see a historical ledger written in the blood and sweat of our ancestors. The 14 colonial wars fought over this island did not check for political alignment, The whips that cracked on the backs of our ancestors at the Four-Door and La Resource estates did not check for party cards. The slave registers of 1816 and 1833 did not categorize our great-great-grandparents by party colors. They suffered as a collective. They resisted as a collective. And today, we must demand structural justice as a unified collective. To the leader of the opposition and the members opposite, I call upon you today to rise to the gravity of this moment. Rise above the temptations of short-term partisan politics. Do not let the history books record that when the youth of St. Lucia stood up to claim their ancestral birthright, you chose to sit down in partisan dissent. Do not let it be said that you chose political convenience over historic justice. Let us recall the year 1844, when the city of Castries was engulfed in righteous riots because a rumor spread that the planters wanted to reinstate slavery. To quell the flames of the rebellion, Governor Torrance stood before our ancestors and declared proudly, "You are forever free. No person can make you slaves once again." Today, the Youth Parliament of St. Lucia answers Governor Torres across the chasm of time. We declare that physical emancipation was only the first step. True freedom is economic and psychological sovereignty. True freedom is the decolonization of our industries, the eradication of the behavioral strain on our workforce, and the end to forced economic servitude to the foreign gaze. Emancipation can never be completed without reparation. Let us pass this resolution unanimously. Let us stand a thunderous, unmistakable message from this chamber to London, to Paris, and to the capitals of the world. St. Lucia speaks with one voice, one heart, one dignity, and one unyielding demand for justice. Mr. Speaker, once again, I proudly support this resolution, and I advocate for it in this honorable House. I thank you.
Member for Vieux-Fort North.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mr. Speaker, this timeless warning reminds us that noble intent alone is not enough to justify policy decisions, especially those with long-term national consequences. I rise today as a proud representative of Vieux-Fort North, a diverse constituency blessed with strong agricultural roots, vibrant cultural traditions, resilient families, and hard-working people who embody the true spirit of St. Lucia. It would be both unjust and intellectually dishonest to deny that slavery and colonialism inflicted profound suffering and left enduring economic and social scars that are still visible throughout our region today. We cannot erase history, nor should we ever disrespect the pain endured by our ancestors. Their struggles must be acknowledged with truth, dignity, and respect. I do not dispute the legitimacy of St. Lucia's claim to reparatory justice. I recognize that these discussions stem from a genuine pursuit of justice and historical redress. I also recognize that many of the structural and developmental challenges still affecting Caribbean societies today did not emerge in isolation, but were in part shaped by the legacy of slavery and colonialism. However, Mr. Speaker, the question before this House is not whether reparations are owed in principle. Ultimately, this House must decide whether this motion is built on substance and practicality rather than aspiration alone. And this is where serious concern arises. While the moral foundation of this reparatory justice may be acknowledged, this House must be careful not to allow well-meaning ideas to evolve into policies that are impractical, unsustainable, or ultimately ineffective. Public policy must be guided not only by emotional and historical pain, but also by practicality, accountability, sustainability, and measurable outcomes. The government's approach appears heavily centered on external pursuits and unresolved international outcomes. However, I believe St. Lucia's long-term progress must remain rooted in internal development, economic productivity, accountability, and self-determined growth. History teaches us that healing and empowerment cannot depend solely on uncertain external support. They must also come from building strength, dignity, independence, and opportunity for ourselves. Mr. Speaker, one of my greatest concerns with this motion is implementation. This motion contains good intentions, but good intentions alone are not clear plans. Where are the timelines? Where are the funding models? Where are the clear financial expectations? Where are the measurable benchmarks for success? The CARICOM 10-point plan may serve as a regional guide, but St. Lucia still requires detailed plans tailored to the realities of our people and community. Which communities will be prioritized, and how will success be ultimately measured? So often, ambitious policy ideas are presented without clear plan for execution, funding, oversight, or sustainability. The government cannot simply hide behind Clause 4 of this motion, a performative promise to develop legislation sometime in the future is not an oversight framework. It is a convenient escape hatch designed to postpone scrutiny and avoid accountability when difficult questions eventually arise. In a small developing nation like St. Lucia, priorities must be carefully balanced, and we must ensure that any commitment made does not divert attention or resources away from urgent domestic needs. Mr. Speaker, another major concern is the issue of cost, accountability, and feasibility. Clause 2 calls on St. Lucia to pursue reparations from Britain and France, including claims linked to climate vulnerability. While this ambition is noted, we must ask practical questions that ordinary citizens themselves are already asking. Who will actually fund this process? Will it be the taxpayer already struggling with rising grocery prices and electricity bills? Will it be the mother trying to stretch a limited income to feed her children for the week? Mr. Speaker, every dollar committed to a long, complex, and speculative international, legal, and diplomatic process is a dollar that must come from somewhere. And so we must ask whether these commitments will come at the expense of already stretched public services or place additional pressure on citizens who are simply trying to survive day to day. This concern becomes even more serious when we consider opportunity cost. Clause 2 does not exist in isolation. It implies years of legal preparation, international advocacy, diplomatic engagement, negotiations, and administrative support. It is funding that could otherwise go directly into fixing roads, improving hospital services, supporting schools, strengthening youth programs, and creating employment opportunities for young people uncertain about their future. And yes, the government may argue that reparation advocacy and national development can happen simultaneously. But this House must still explain precisely how these initiatives will be funded without burdening already strained national resources. Hope is not an economic policy. St. Lucians cannot live on symbolic victories alone. Clause 3 relies on the National Reparation Committee to coordinate research and advocacy. Let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker. We do not oppose the educational work of the National Reparation Committee, and we welcome efforts to support it. But an advocacy committee is not a financial governance structure. A committee designed to host lectures is not equipped to manage potential repertory resources, nor does it replace the need for an independent oversight body. The government is confusing public relations with public policy. Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia is an independent nation. While reparatory justice may be pursued in principle, we must be careful not to create the impression that national progress, cultural preservation, or institutional development can only occur if reparations are first secured. If we believe our history must be preserved, we must integrate it into our school curricula today, rather than wait for a European check to fund our cultural education. As a representative of Beaufort North, home to Belleville, a community many proudly regard as the cultural capital of St. Lucia, I understand deeply the importance of preserving our heritage, identity, and artistic legacy. Journée Creole in Belleville last year was a testament of how much we take culture seriously. If you missed it, then you missed out on a cultural explosion. Belleville has produced iconic cultural features such as Gregory Sinais, the late Joseph Romapoleon, and Patrick Guillot Bernardin, along with cultural groups such as Avot Service, all of whom have helped keep the spirit, traditions, creativity, and cultural pride of our people alive across generations. Culture is as the root and very soul of Beaufort North, and I would be doing my people a disservice if I did not stand and adequately represent them. And precisely because culture matters so deeply to us, I believe we must continue investing in preserving and strengthening ourselves, regardless of uncertain external outcomes. Independence must mean more than political separation. It must also mean confidence in our ability to build, develop, and invest in ourselves regardless of external outcomes. As an independent nation, we can actively build educational, trade, tourism, cultural, and investment partnership with African nations right now. In fact, St. Lucia has already demonstrated the ability to pursue meaningful relationships with Africa through diplomacy and engagement, including the recent visit of Bola Ahmed Tinubu to St. Lucia. That visit reflected the very kind of proactive partnership building that can strengthen ties between Africa and the Caribbean without requiring St. Lucia to place its development on hold while awaiting uncertain reparation outcomes. Another concern relates to whether these reparation demands can realistically be enforced. While the moral arguments surrounding reparatory justice may be compelling, moral arguments alone do not automatically create binding legal obligations under international laws. So we must ask, where is the clear international legal consensus obligating former colonial powers to provide reparations in the forms proposed? And what legal mechanism exists to realistically guarantee such outcomes? These questions matter because St. Lucians deserve honesty about what is realistically achievable and what remains internationally contested. The government continues speaking around the motion rather than to the motion. Emotional appeals cannot replace clear answers on implementation, accountability, reality, and sustainability. Mr. Speaker, my final concern relates to the long-term national self-reliance. St. Lucia cannot afford to anchor its future on outcomes that are distant, contested, and beyond its control. We must therefore ask, what safeguards exist to ensure sustainable national development, even if external reparatory support changes over time? The young graduates searching for work, the struggling parents, and the family worried about rising costs are asking for opportunity, stability, and results now. That reality is deeply personal to me, because these are the concerns shared with me every day by young people in Beaufort North searching for opportunity, parents working tirelessly to provide for their families, and hard-working citizens simply hoping for a better future. No country develops sustainability through compensation alone. Long-term prosperity is built through productivity, innovation, entrepreneurship, investment, sound governance, and disciplined economic planning. I believe in a St. Lucia that is confident in its own potential, a St. Lucia that invests in its people, a St. Lucia that empowers its youth, strengthens its institutions, modernizes its economy, revitalizes agriculture, embraces innovation, and creates real opportunity for its citizens. I believe in a nation that does not wait passively for this development, but actively pursues it through productivity, entrepreneurship, education, accountability, and disciplined economic planning. These are the pillars upon which sustainable national development is built, regardless of whether reparations are ever achieved. St. Lucia deserves development plans, not development promises. Mr. Speaker, our ancestors fought for freedom, endured unimaginable suffering, and still managed to build families, communities, and nations from the ashes of oppression. Their legacy is not only one of pain, it is also one of resilience, strength, perseverance, and survival. I believe we honor that legacy not only by remembering the injustices of our past, but also by building a nation worthy of their sacrifice. True national development cannot depend solely on promises abroad. It must also be built through discipline, accountability, resilience, sound governance, and the determination of our own people. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. This contribution is not rejecting justice. It is demanding responsibility, realism, sustainability, and a genuinely St. Lucia-focused approach to development. Because justice must not only be demanded from history, it must also be built through the choices we make today. History must guide us, but it must never prevent us from building the future our people deserve. No ni pour bâtir St. Lucie pour nous-mêmes. We must build St. Lucia for ourselves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Micoud South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fellow youth parliamentarians, the beautiful people of Micoud South, and the resilient people of St. Lucia, good morning. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in this honorable chamber not just as the voice of Micoud South or the Minister of Education, Youth Development, Sports, and Digital Transformation. I rise as a descendant ready and willing to shed light on a resolution that is not merely a collection of words but a historical reckoning. This resolution demands that we address the generational fractures left behind by centuries of uncompensated cruelty, colonial exploitation, and systematic erasure. Mr. Speaker, when we speak of reparatory justice, our opponents often look at us and ask, why dwell on the past? Why look back when you should be looking forward? They even mock our efforts as a grasp for handouts. To them, I say, You cannot heal a wound that you refuse to acknowledge, and you most certainly cannot heal a wound while the weapon is still resting in the flesh. Look around you. We don't need to dig up a grave to find the legacy of slavery. It is alive and well in the very fabric of our everyday Caribbean life. Look at how our society is structured. When you see our people still color-coding worth, where the shade of your skin or the texture of your hair dictates how you are treated in society, so much so that even our music reflects the pain of colorism and self-rejection. A typical example is Black Hypocrisy, sung by Jamaican dancehall artist Spice, who calls out the hypocrisy of a society that celebrates Black culture, yet still treats lighter skin as superior to darker skin. And Mr. Speaker, as the song by Lucky Dube reminds us, different colors, one people. Yet slavery and colonialism planted a mindset that taught our people to divide themselves by complexion instead of unite through identity. When you see our economic dependency, where we are forced to import almost everything we eat, Mr. Speaker, while our fertile lands sit underutilized, that is the ghost of an economy designed solely to feed Europe while starving the local population. But Mr. Speaker, let us talk about the most damaging, insidious thing the plantation did to us. It attacked our family structure. It broke the Caribbean family. Back then, the white enslaver treated our Black ancestors as mere livestock. Black men were used as breeders, forced to father children across multiple estates, stripped of the right to be a husband, stripped of the responsibility of being a present father, and forbidden from protecting their own households. And what do we see today? We see that exact same trauma repackaged and wearing a suit. Today we see men, even those high up in society, professional men, educated men, still running around, fathering children here, there, everywhere, abandoning their emotional duties and doing it quote-unquote professionally. They treat sweet talking and stepping out as a badge of honor, and they have normalized this broken home. Mr. Speaker, that is not a cultural trait. That is a psychological scar. Slavery may have been abolished, but its effects still linger, breathing in our broken homes. Mr. Speaker, with your prior permission, I would like to take the members of this honorable House on a journey, especially those sitting opposite me. In the tragic murder of Aiden Fushi in the United States, the sister of the victim, Tristan Bailey, stood before the courtroom and one by one dropped 114 stones into a jar, one for every stab wound her sister had received. The weight of each stone was a testimony. The act broke through every legal formality and spoke directly to the conscience of every person in that room. Now today, I want to borrow that courage. In this bag right here, I hold marbles, and each marble represents something. The first marble represents the year 1605, when the first English invaders landed from the Olive Branch, the initial bloody slaughter of our indigenous Kalinago brothers and sisters who were hunted and killed like animals for land. For the implementation of the Barbados Slave Trade Code of 1661, this marble represents the codification of human horror, legally defining African human beings as chattel. This next marble is for Petroni. On the morning of Tuesday, April 9th, 1833, on the Fordor Estate in Dennery, she refused to work because she was ill. Although asked to carry out several tasks, she refused. She then hid in the cane fields, and at 4:15 p.m., she was brought to Hadi de Bocage and put in the pillory. She hung there by her neck and wrists in the blazing sun. When they came to release her, she was dead. The verdict, accidental death. This next marble is for Kwashiba. In 1787, a notice appeared in the Barbados Gazette. A runaway enslaved woman named Kwashiba, stout and well-made, with a scar on her left hand, Her owner advertised for 3 weeks, then silence. 2 years later, in a jail record from Castries, St. Lucia, a woman appears. She identifies herself in French as Quafiba. She has made her way from Barbados to St. Lucia. She survived on an island where little English was spoken. She found refuge in Micoud, my constituency. She lived free for nearly 2 years, speaking Creole, building networks, surviving. The system tried to hold her. She refused to be held. For the Brandon Irons, this one represents the thousands of St. Lucian slaves who had the initials of British and French enslavers burned directly into their chest and shoulder flesh with hot red iron. The smell of burning human skin marking them as corporate property forever. For the public executions used to terrify our people. For the torture on the plantation fields. This marble represents the thousands of men and women whose backs were sliced open by the 9-tailed whips, leaving raw, infected skin exposed to the blazing sun in the sugarcane fields of Cul-de-Sac and Roseau Valley. For the thousands of African women who never got a chance to see their babies after giving birth because they were ripped from their arms and sold away to separate estates. For the thousands of lives lost during the Middle Passage, where our people were packed so tightly in the suffocating pitch-black bellies of the slave ships that they lay in their own blood and vomit for days. The last marble, for the complete destruction of the mind, where it was a crime punishable by public flaying for a black person to even look at a book, to try to read, or to try to learn. Mr. Speaker, look at this jar. Every single clink of these marbles tell us that the bill is overdue. Now that this honorable house has understood the true gravity of slavery and the way its effects still echo throughout our Caribbean society today, it is time that we shift our attention to the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, not as a cry for sympathy, but as a structured and legitimate roadmap for repair, development, and justice for the people of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, Clause 5 calls for the comprehensive education reform to include African and Caribbean history, cultural identity, and reparations awareness embedded in our school's curricula. Mr. Speaker, earlier, if you didn't notice, I looked in the gallery and I saw young, vibrant students from Micoud Secondary and now joining us, Leseta Combined. And as Minister for Education, I am compelled to ask, what are we teaching our children? Why is it that our children can recite the names of European monarchs yet cannot name the enslaved men and women whose labor built those very empires? Why can our children trace the borders of countries they may have never visited, yet cannot name the estates across St. Lucia where our ancestors lived, suffered, and endured unimaginable agony? And the simple answer to that is we have not taught them. The names of Petroni, of Flor, of Kwashiba, these must be in our classrooms. The stories of the brigand wars in the Caribbean during the French Revolution, the Fedon's Revolution of 1795 to 1796 in Grenada, the Second Carib War of 1791 to 1792 in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Flor Bois-Gaillard, the UNIA March of 1921, which happened right here in St. Lucia. This history belongs to our children, and it is time we stop depriving them of that knowledge. As minister, I stand committed to that reform. As Marcus Garvey once said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Mr. Speaker, let us plant those roots. Furthermore, my portfolio extends far beyond the classroom and leaves me with the heavy yet rewarding responsibility of youth and sports development initiatives within the country. Clause 7 speaks directly to one of the most critical aspects of reparatory justice, which is youth engagement and leadership in reparations, advocacy, and decision-making processes. And I believe that we have already laid the foundation for this through the implementation of the St. Lucia National Youth Policy 2025 to 2030. While I can confidently tie all 8 pillars of the policy to the reparations movement, 2 pillars stand out as essentially critical. 1, education and lifelong learning reminds us that justice must begin with knowledge. The policy speaks to expanding youth education and strengthening learning opportunities, ensuring that young people are equipped with the tools necessary for national development. Which is why I call upon district youth and sports councils, I call upon youth workers, youth organizations to organize workshops, organize seminars, panel discussions within their respective zones to educate young people on reparations and the part that they play in this movement. Furthermore, the pillar participation rights and empowered citizenship further reinforces that young people must not simply inherit the conversations of reparations, but actively lead it. The policy specifically promotes youth participation in governance and decision-making. It calls for strengthening youth-led organizations like the St. Lucia National Youth Councils and various district youth and sports councils to facilitate meaningful youth engagement in governance and democracy. Mr. Speaker, the reparations movement must become a youth-driven movement where young St. Lucians are empowered to advocate for justice, to preserve our history, and shape the future of reparatory justice. However, we must first play our part and make available the necessary information. Mr. Speaker, the reality is we cannot undo slavery, nor can we erase the suffering, the displacement, and the exploitation that built empires at the expense of our ancestors. But what we can do is repair. Reparatory justice is not charity. It is the acknowledgement of a historical debt whose effects still live within our communities, our education systems, and the struggles of our youth today. If the wealth created from slavery continues to exist, then the responsibility for repair must exist as well. Let St. Lucia be remembered not as a nation that fears confrontation of the truth, but as a people courageous enough to demand dignity, empower our youth, and transform inherited pain into progress. And when future generations ask what we did as a youth parliament when the movement came to stand for justice, let our actions speak for itself. We took a stand, we spoke, and we demanded repair. In closing, I urge the opposition and I urge the people of St. Lucia, let us not fight against this resolution. Instead, let us put our heads together in unity and make comprehensive recommendations that will give the young people of St. Lucia a better future, a future worthy of their brilliance. And though the locks falling to my back may just be for style, I remain committed to restoring African pride, preserving Caribbean identity, and ensuring that we the descendants walk boldly in the dignity that slavery once tried to strip away, through my strong support for this motion on reparatory justice. I thank you.
Member for Babono.
Mr. Speaker, all the members of this House, spectators in the gallery and online, good morning. You know, it's so strange that The government keeps mentioning the opposition and they're not focusing on the actual motion. But however, moving along, I rise today as the member for Babono, a place that is respected island-wide for its proud farming heritage, producing some of the freshest ground provisions, vegetables, and spices you can find. The community's natural beauty, its cool mountain breeze, lush greenery, scenic valleys, make it feel like a peaceful escape while still being close to the heartbeat of Castries. And the famous words are, hold them. Today, Mr. Speaker, I can stand proudly as a member of this opposition to address a matter that carries both the weight of our history and the responsibility of our reparatory justice. Before I begin, I wish to state clearly so that no one inside or outside this chamber misrepresents my position. Reparations are owed. Reparations are just. Reparations are a moral, historical, and legal obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. The opposition does not deny that. The opposition does not downplay the horrors of enslavement, and the opposition will never silence the voices of our ancestors. But, Mr. Speaker, acknowledging that reparations are owed is not the same as accepting the government's approach. The question before this House today is not, are reparations justified? We all know the answer is yes. The real question is, does this government have a realistic, accountable, and St. Lucia-centered plan to pursue and manage reparations? And, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, the answer is no, they do not. Mr. Speaker, the government has built its case on emotion, powerful emotion, but not reality. Let us examine the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The United Kingdom under both major parties has held the same position for decades. No apology, no reparations. As noted by Hilary Beckles, the British Parliament as early as 2007 said exactly that. And recently, the UK abstained, not supported, not endorsed, but abstained on the UN resolution that this government proudly quotes in its own preamble. Mr. Speaker, when a country refuses to apologize, what makes us think they will suddenly decide to send millions of dollars? The government is selling St. Lucians a dream, but the opposition will tell the truth. We are not saying reparations are impossible. We are saying that in the near term, political feasibility is extremely low, and responsible leaders must plan accordingly. Mr. Speaker, the government keeps waving around the CARICOM 10-point plan as if it's a St. Lucian policy. Let me make this clear. CARICOM plan is a regional guide. It is not a St. Lucian plan. It does not tell us that Babono has Taco Thursday. It does not tell us what happens in Soufrière, Dennery, Vieux-Fort, or Castries East. If education is priority, which schools? If healthcare is priority, which hospitals? If infrastructure is priority, how do we sustain it after funds run out? The government have no answers because they have no plan. The National Reparations Committee is mentioned in the motion. But, Mr. Speaker, where is their report? Where is their roadmap? What have they produced so the people of St. Lucia can examine? We cannot base the future of this country on vague aspirations. Mr. Speaker, the government proudly points to Clause 4 as evidence of transparency. But when you examine it closely, it does not provide accountability, it avoids it. The clause simply says the government will develop legislation to govern the transparent management of any reparation resources. On the surface, this sounds admirable. But, Mr. Speaker, in practice, it means absolutely nothing. Let me explain why. It is not a framework. It is a promise that someday, somehow, something might be drafted. Legislation is only as strong as the people who write it. Without clear principles, timelines, or mandatory safeguards, this clause becomes nothing more than a blank check for whichever government happens to be in office. Any administration today, or 10 years from now, could manipulate the language, shape the structure, or weaken the oversight according to its own political priorities. So instead of accountability being guaranteed, accountability becomes negotiable. It leaves every important question unanswered. If the government was serious, they would tell us, will the fund be independent of the cabinet? Who will appoint the oversight body? Will audits be mandatory or optional? Will Parliament have oversight or merely be informed? Will communities have representation or will politicians alone control the resources? Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 answers none of these questions. It gives the government flexibility, not the country's security. It is accountability by slogan, not accountability by structure. Mr. Speaker, anyone can write a clause that says, quote unquote, we will create legislation. That is the political equivalent of saying, trust us, we'll figure it out later. But Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia cannot be asked to trust blindly when we are dealing with a matter as serious as reparations. Trust is not enough. We need clear rules, independent bodies, audit requirements, sunset clauses, and public reporting. This clause provides none of that. It is accountability theater, not accountability in practice. It gives power to the government, not protection to citizens. Real accountability limits the government. This clause expands it. Real accountability constrains the hands of the cabinet. This clause frees them. Real accountability is detailed, enforceable, and specific. This clause is vague, flexible, and political. And finally, it is hypocritical. Mr. Speaker, how can a government that has struggled to provide clarity on existing national funds suddenly ask us to trust them with reparation funds? They are asking the people of St. Lucia to believe that an undefined future law will somehow solve the very governance problems that they have been unable to address in the present. This is not accountability. This is wishful thinking, wrapped in legislation-sounding language. Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia has been independent for 47 years. However, independence is not a date, it is an attitude. How can we preach independence while anchoring our development strategy to former colonial powers? How can we claim sovereignty while waiting for Britain and France to quote-unquote bless us with financial restoration? Let me be clear, we must pursue justice, but we must not depend on it. Our development cannot be placed in the hands of the very nations we fought to liberate ourselves from. It is contradictory, it is inconsistent, and it is irresponsible. CARICOM gives the region a framework, but a framework is not a policy. A list is not a strategy. And this government has turned guiding principles into empty slogans. These forms of reparations are achievable now, if only the government will move beyond talking points and into actual execution. They will strengthen St. Lucia from within and provide long-term benefits that no one-off check ever could. So why ignore these tangible pathways? Because the government prefers the frame reparations as a financial jackpot. But reparations is not a lottery. They are justice, and justice requires more than repeating a regional document. It requires a national plan. Mr. Speaker, there is a cost to everything. Championing reparations requires diplomatic resources, legal teams, international lobbying, and sustained advocacy. All of this costs taxpayers' dollars. Meanwhile, we have already seen a strain in our relationship with the United Kingdom, our largest tourism partner. 15% of our visitors come from the UK, and we just lost visa-free access. What happens if the relationship becomes more strained? The government will not say it, but the opposition must. Mr. Speaker, this government is anchoring our national hopes to a country that is actively tightening its borders against us, as seen with our recent loss of visa-free access. We must boldly demand the justice we are owed. But true independence means diversing our international partners today, not passively waiting for British goodwill tomorrow. And while we spend years chasing Britain and France, trade negotiations with African nations are actually progressing with real opportunities today. We must be strategic, not reckless. Mr. Speaker, The government is presenting a dream without a blueprint. They are relying on emotion to distract from the fact that they have no national plan, no accountability structure, no sustainability roadmap, no diplomatic strategy, no concrete timelines, no financial framework. This is not leadership, this is not policy, this is not vision, this is political theater. The opposition position is simple, responsible and patriotic. Reparations are owed. Reparations must be pursued. Reparations must be managed with transparency, and reparations must benefit the everyday St. Lucian. We advocate a St. Lucia specific reparations plan, independent oversight, diverse international partnerships, and development strategies that do not rely on external gifts. This is how a serious country moves forward. In closing, Mr. Speaker, reparations is not just about anger. It is not about revenge. It is not about handouts. It is about dignity. It is about our history. It is about our ancestors who built this world with their blood. It is about ensuring that St. Lucia does not only fight for justice, but is prepared to manage justice responsibly. We cannot allow reparations to become political fantasy or national dependency. We must be honest with our people. We must be strategic with our planning. We must be accountable in our governance. And above all, we must be responsible with our future. Once again, reparations are owed, but responsibility is required. And with that, Mr. Speaker, is where this government has failed. I thank you.
Member for Castries Central.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon, honorable members. Mr. Speaker, I find it very comical, to say the least, in hearing the members opposite. It seems that some of them are inadequate because a resolution in itself is a statement of intent and opinion. An action plan is not inherently required. So I'd like to state this. Mr. Speaker.
Member for Castries.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. The member is misleading the House. We are not debating a resolution, we are debating a motion. A resolution refers to a document that has already been passed. And if your document references a resolution, then you have brought an inadequate document to this honorable House.
Thank you, Member for Castries. Member for Castries Central, you will proceed.
Mr. Speaker, many resolutions are simply a formal expression of intent, policy, or opinion. So I will not take back my statement, Mr. Speaker. A resolution does not require an action.
Member for Castries.
Mr. Speaker, the member is again misleading the House. No one has indicated to the member to withdraw his statement. The member is referencing the document by the wrong terminology.
Member for Castries. Member for Castries. Member for Castries. Member. When the speaker is speaking, use. That's it. Thank you. Proceed, Member for Castries Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to state that I am in full support of the Reparatory Justice Resolution 2026, Mr. Speaker. And in hearing the Prime Minister and the Minister speak, I honestly think that this House should have been adjourned because the ayes obviously have it. Mr. Speaker, I would like to bring light to two colors, and that is red and blue. You may be asking yourself, why red and blue, Mr. Speaker? I say that red and blue is a symbol, Mr. Speaker. These colors represent two of the best heroes. One represents hope, justice, and resilience. And although they are not human themselves, they represent humanity. And the other represents great responsibility in getting great power from when they were young. You may be asking yourself, what relevance does this have to the speech? Like many of us here, we are in blue, even the opposition. So I say to them, today, we have a great responsibility to set our differences aside and pass this resolution in this House today. I would like to bring light to the section that states, it urges the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues for reparations from both the British and the French relating to the enduring socio-economic and environmental impacts of slavery and colonialism, including climate vulnerability. Mr. Speaker, reparations are not monetary. We are not asking the British, we are not asking the French for a check. So let that be clear. We are not asking for money. Reparations are not aid. They are a payment for the vulnerabilities imposed upon us. Climate change is the clearest manifestation of historical injustice still afflicting our nation today. The transatlantic slave trade, better yet known as the gravest crime against humanity, and plantation colonialism generated enormous wealth for the British and the French. As a St. Lucian, we often hear 7 times British, 7 times French, they fought for the Helen of the West. That's a very calm way of saying it. It's like saying that they fought for the beauty. They fought because St. Lucia was beautiful. Mr. Speaker, they fought because we were money. They saw us nothing but money in their pockets. And this wealth directly financed and accelerated the Industrial Revolution. Slave labor produced the sugar, it produced the cotton, and it produced the other commodities that provided capital for the very same factories, mills, and infrastructure in Europe. Mr. Speaker, the Industrial Revolution then unleashed the large-scale burning of fossil fuels, and that began the era of massive greenhouse gas emissions. In simple terms, for the opposition, the unpaid labor of our enslaved ancestors helped power the machines that are now warming our planet. While St. Lucia and the Caribbean contributed almost nothing to global emissions, we suffer some of the worst consequences. As a small island developing state, we face more intense and frequent hurricanes. We face prolonged droughts followed by extreme rainfall causing flash floods and landslides. We face rising sea levels and coastal erosion. The environment is going through a degradation left from colonial plantation systems and by the global emissions that flowed from the Industrial Revolution. Mr. Speaker, these climate impacts strike hardest in the sector under my responsibility, which is agriculture, fisheries, and food security. Our farmers are on the front line of this crisis. Hurricanes destroy crops, it destroys greenhouses and farming infrastructure. The intense rainfall triggers landslides that wash away precious topsoil, especially on the steep hillsides where many small farmers were historically pushed. A drought reduces yields and causes livestock issues, particularly among young goats during prolonged wet or cool periods. Mr. Speaker, sedimation from heavy rains clog aquaculture ponds and damages island production. These repeated shocks increase our food prices, it heightens our dependence on imports and threatens the stability of rural communities. The colonial legacy of monoculture and marginal land use left us with depleted soils, and heightened exposure, now supercharged by climate change born from the Industrial Revolution. You would believe that the monetary benefits from the plantations would have went to improving our farming infrastructure. But no, Mr. Speaker, they went to the very same persons who abused our family members. For example, Mr. Speaker, William Mutter awarded £3,353, roughly estimated to be €550,000 today, for owning estates like Union and Bossejoux, ownership of over 160 enslaved individuals. Mr. Speaker, do you know what he used the money for? He then used that very same money he was awarded to go from a plantation owner to a commission merchant, allowing him to charge interest and fees to the same struggling planters profiting from the island's post-abolition debt. Mr. Speaker, another family, Rene and Pierre Auger of Labrie from the Choc estate, enslaved over 123 of our family members, and they were awarded roughly £3,140, estimated to be worth €518. Mr. Speaker, this information is public record. The Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, established at UCL with the support of the Hutchison Center at Harvard. I say this to say, Mr. Speaker, that these surnames are still engraved into our society, yet the enslaved and their descendants received nothing. We received no capital, we received no land redistribution, we received no support for independent farming. And even after emancipation in 1844, with the apprenticeship period extending forced labor until 1848, many had very little choice but to return to the same plantation as poorly paid laborers or sharecroppers. This locked in a plantation-dependent model that favored export monocrops and extractive interest over broad-based development. The result? A persistent agriculture divide that still hampers us today, Mr. Speaker. Small farm holders, mostly worked by descendants of the enslaved, average just a few acres, often on marginal land. Traditional methods still dominate, with limited mechanization, modern irrigation technology, or value-added processing. This leaves our sector vulnerable to price shocks, vulnerable to diseases, vulnerable to hurricanes, and import competition, while countries that broke free of similar legacies advance faster in productivity and diversification. It is the root of why St. Lucian agriculture's lags in capability compared to better resource nations. The British compensated the slave owners using the very same taxpayer funds that was recently paid off only in 2015 and helped entrench the old power struggles. The French laid the plantation foundations and profited similarly during their periods of control. Both of these nations extracted wealth from our land and labor for centuries. That is why the call for reparations from Britain under France is not about guilt. It is about repair and justice for our people. Targeted repertory investment would fund land reform and consolidation for viable farm sizes, widespread access to appropriate technology for our farming industry, sedimation from heavy rain, Mr. Speaker, research extensive services, irrigation and climate resilient diversification, cooperatives and processing infrastructure to build local wealth instead of extraction. Mr. Speaker, the slave owners received their reparations 190 years ago. It is time we, the descendants of the enslaved, receive support to finally transform the sectors they built with our unpaid labor. Recognizing this history will strengthen our case. True development requires addressing the foundational imbalances so agriculture can drive prosperity for all St. Lucians, not perpetuate dependency. Reparations from Britain and France must therefore include substantial support for climate-smart agriculture and resilience building, Mr. Speaker. It must also include mangrove restoration and advance early warning signs. It is justice that allows our farmers and fishers to feed our nation with dignity even as the climate changes, Mr. Speaker. By supporting this resolution, we affirm the same historical forces that enriched Europe through slavery and the Industrial Revolution. We now carry a responsibility to help St. Lucia build a resilient and food-secure future. So, Mr. Speaker, I am asking all the members here today, let us turn reparatory justice into real action, not just for our farmers, not just for our fishers, but for everyone in St. Lucia, including our children and the future generation. Because with the great power given to us here by our people comes a great responsibility. Thank you.
Member for Micoud South.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to move a motion that we break for lunch for 1 hour.
Honorable members, the question is that this House break for lunch for 1 hour. I now put the question. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. As many as of the contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. We break for lunch.
Our young people have done an extremely fantastic job so far. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. The young people continue to be exceptional in the youth parliamentary sitting here today. Some of you have heard the discussion on the report of justice. Some of you may be for it, some of you may be against it, but you cannot deny that the young people have done their
Phenomenal. They've done phenomenal.
valuable arguments in this city. I look forward to hearing the rest after lunch.
Yes, I do. So stay tuned and join us after lunch so that you can continue hearing what the youth have to say.
Indeed.